Hello, everybody. Welcome to PS 382. This is Systems and Theories in Psychology. My name is Dr. Briner. I'm going to be your instructor for this course. And what we're doing in this class is taking a look at the history of psychology and the things that came before psychology that tried to do the same thing that we're doing, which is understand human behavior, understand the human mind. And we're also going to take a look at some of the major schools of thought within psychology. So what we're going to be doing for week one is looking at the history of psychology, especially what has gone on before the advent of what we might think of as modern psychology. So we're going to be doing this week is looking at some of the ancient philosophers, some of the philosophers in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and the ideas about the human brain and the human mind that they came up with before people started really scientifically studying human behavior. So people have been studying the mind long before psychology became its own discipline, right? If you think about what philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle were trying to do, it was understanding what people were, what's our nature, what's our role in the universe. Those are the same kinds of questions that psychologists ask today, and also philosophers. But what we're going to see is the way that the thinkers back then asked those questions and investigated those questions differs significantly from what we as psychologists do today. And, most scientific disciplines don't make you take a course about the history of the discipline. And we're going to be looking during week one at why that is for psychology. So why is it that we teach a class in the history of psychology? What are we trying to accomplish here? And part of that is that knowing our history is going to help you to understand the current views in psychology, what the debates are, and why there's often little consensus from one school of thought to the next. So what we're going to be doing in this class is using the methods of historiography. So that means this class is going to be kind of like a psych class, but also kind of like a history class. And we have to think about the methods of investigation, some of the limitations that come with both of those approaches. So in psychology, right, you can run an experiment and try to get an answer to a question. And the barrier is how well have you designed your experiment? How accurately are you interpreting your results? With historiography, there are other kinds of barriers, and these have to do with the kinds of evidence that has been preserved throughout the years. So when you're looking at history and you're looking at primary sources, well, what's a primary source? It's whoever was there at the time, whoever was witnessing it, kind of like how in psychology we call a primary source something that was written by the person who conducted the experiment. In history, a primary source is somebody who was there to witness the event. So if you're looking at Darwin's journal about his time in the Galapagos Islands, or if you're looking at research notes that somebody like John Watson or B.F. Skinner collected and compiled, those would be examples of primary historical documents. And just like all kinds of evidence can, be sort of limited or incomplete or wrong, well, the same thing happens in history. So some of the things that can limit us in this are lost or suppressed data. So if somebody, say, burns all of their research notes before they die or burns their journals, then we have lost a source of information. Sometimes new data comes to light from, lives that were lived hundreds of years ago. So if you think about Darwin, right? So Darwin's theories are being published about the time of the Civil War here in the States. And only in the 1990s, right? So more than 130 years later, new information starts becoming available about Darwin and his life and his thoughts and his views. Sometimes data can get distorted, especially when you're translating from one language to another. So if you've taken my psychology of language class, you might remember us talking about how there often aren't direct translations from one language to another. And that's true for German and English. So Freud spoke German, and he talked about this concept called Einfall. And it gets translated as free association into English. And we subsequently start thinking about it like, oh, well, that means I'm going to sit down, I'm going to say what comes to my mind, and then what comes next, and then what comes next, and what comes next, right? So dog, bark, woof, woof, meow, cat, oh my God, I hate my father, right? That's the way that we kind of think about what Einfall means. but that's sort of a mistranslation. Einfall means something more like invasion or intrusion in German. So what Freud was interested in wasn't just making these weird associations. It was about intrusive thoughts or things that come into your mind unbidden. One other thing that limits our data here, self-serving or biased data. So if we think about the historical records, let's say that you have a lab where there's one guy sort of running the show and there's other people who work for that person. Well, that one guy might take credit for everything that the people who worked for him did, right? And if that's the case, that's going to minimize the contributions from a historical standpoint of the people who worked for him. This has especially been the case when, let's say, the people who are working for the head guy tend to be women or minorities, right? Their contributions have been sort of downplayed in the historical record, and whoever was compiling the records, usually a white dude, was the one who sort of played up their own roles. So self-serving reports, biased perspectives, biased data can also be a limitation when we're dealing with history. We also have to think about the zeitgeist, right? So when we think about historiography, one question that often comes up is how much of this is influenced by the spirit of the times, right? What was going on out there sort of in the ether? So you might think about this in recent terms with, let's say, our current focus on things like police brutality and racism, right? It's not that those things are ever out of the news, but sometimes they are more in the focus, more in the spotlight than others. And right now it's very much in the spotlight, especially after what happened with George Floyd. So that's part of our zeitgeist right now. If you think about the way that coronavirus has affected our lives and the way we live it and the way we think about the world, that's part of our zeitgeist as well. Zeitgeist literally means time ghost, but really it means something like the spirit of the time. Economic opportunities. So sometimes psychology goes in certain directions because that's where the money is at the time. There is a lot of money, a lot of grant money available for research in aging right now because of our aging population. Speaking of coronavirus, right, a lot of people are writing grants about the psychological effects of coronavirus right now because those are things that they feel are more likely to get funded. I'm not saying that they're completely mercenary in their motivations, but that is one of the motivating factors. Um, Things like war, right? And what happens during that time. So there was a lot of research, for example, after the Iraq War on the psychology of torture because of the allegations of things that happened like at Abu Ghraib and so-called enhanced interrogation like waterboarding. But also World War One. So one of the reasons that we have IQ tests is because of the First World War. We have this war where suddenly technology becomes very important. You don't just put a spear or a musket in somebody's hands and say, all right, go forth and kill. Now they need to know how to fly an airplane or operate a tank or use a belt-fed machine gun. So you need to know who's smart enough to do that, right? Who's intelligent enough to be able to use this complicated technology. And so we start seeing the first IQ tests being used in war as a way to sort of distinguish who can perform one task from who might not be able to perform that as well. And also prejudice and discrimination, like we said, a lot of colleges did not admit women, did not admit minorities. It was very hard, even up until the middle of the 20th century to get a college education if you were a woman or Black or Jewish, et cetera, right? A lot of the colleges only admitted certain demographics, de facto, if not as part of their actual college code. So that means that a lot of people who could have made contributions were sort of kept out of the game, and a lot of people who made it into a career in psychology had their contributions sort of diminished in the historical record until relatively recently. And also relationships, right? What gets preserved? Well, things often that come from big labs because there's a lot of people and more chance that somebody's going to write it down. So these are some of the things that are kind of challenges when we look at the history of psychology or history in general. One major debate in history that's sort of ongoing, right? It's one of these persistent questions is what drives the major events of history. If we think about things like World War II and the rise of the Nazis in Germany, how do we explain that, right? Is it because this charismatic guy named Adolf Hitler just happened to entrance an entire country into believing these racist fascist ideologies? Or was there something within the spirit of the German people at the time that was already sort of primed for fascism? Maybe as a result of World War One and the economic hardships, or maybe some kind of underlying philosophy that existed within Germany at the time. So two perspectives. One of these is the personalistic perspective. So changes in scientific history are attributable to the ideas of unique individuals. That means that, you take away Pavlov, nobody would have discovered classical conditioning. You take away Skinner, nobody would have discovered operant conditioning. That's what the personalistic perspective is that these major events in history, in our case, the history of psychology, are driven by individuals who were making discoveries that nobody else would have made at that time. Another perspective is the naturalistic view that says, well, this is where the progress was leading at the time. So, if there hadn't been a Pavlov, there would have been someone else who had discovered it because that was the focus at the time. Or if there hadn't been a B.F. Skinner, there would have been somebody to come along to fulfill that role. A good example of this is the theory of evolution, right? So Darwin wasn't the only person interested in evolution. There were other competing theories of evolution, and he actually had to rush to get his book published because there was another scientist who was about to publish pretty much the exact same theory as Darwin's. So, even if Darwin hadn't existed, it's a good bet that somebody else would have published a similar theory during that same time. Now, like most things, the reality is probably some combination of this. I know that's a boring answer and it's a vague answer, but it's kind of necessarily vague, right? There's a spirit of the times, and sometimes that spirit of the times generates a person, and sometimes it's the other way around, right? Sometimes there's a person who influences and generates a spirit of the times, and sometimes those two sort of feed back onto each other. Now, in psychology and in science in general, there's some key concepts we need to think about. One is a system, which is just a collection of ideas that defines some kind of psychological topic and how you study it. There are theories, which are plausible explanations for how a system of evidence can be explained, or an explanation for a set of findings that we've already collected. And then there are schools of thought, so different ways of focusing on the mind, right? The mind is incredibly complex. There's never going to be, or at least in our lifetime, there's not likely to be one theory that clearly explains every facet of behavior. So that means there are these different schools of thought and these different approaches. So let me give you an example of a system. So a lot of you probably remember classical conditioning from intro or from human and animal learning. So just as a refresher, you got a dog who naturally salivates in response to food. In frame 2, we have this dog who listens to a bell ring. He's got no salivatory response, right? The dog doesn't think the bell is food. So the dog doesn't salivate, he just hears a bell, and that's all he's doing. He's hearing a bell. But if you ring that bell enough times, and every time you ring that bell, you give the dog food, like we're doing here in 3, ring, food, salivates because of the food, ring, food, salivates because of the food. Eventually what happens is the bell rings and the dog salivates before the food even starts coming out. So that's a system of research within psychology, Pavlovian learning. In other words, classical conditioning. So some theories here try to explain why this happens. So we have a system of research on classical conditioning. We have these observations, but why does it happen? What is making the dog salivate in response to the bell? So there are a couple different theories about this, and these are two competing theories about what's going on. So theory A, this is the theory that Pavlov initially supported, was that the dog mistakes the bell for the food itself. So when the dog hears the bell, it's showing up in the dog's mind as if it were food. The dog is salivating because his neural pathways have been rewired by conditioning. So normally the dog would hear the sound of the bell, and the brain's wiring would send that signal to the auditory cortex in the brain. But what Pavlov thought was happening was I got rewired. And so instead of experiencing that sound as a bell, that the signal gets rewired, redirected towards the hunger center of the brain, quote unquote, and the dog starts feeling hungry because it's interpreting the sound as if it were food. That's one way you can try to explain that. Another way this has a little bit more credibility these days says the dog's learning the bell as a signal for food. The dog isn't mistaking the bell for food. What's happening is the dog salivates because he's learned the pattern. We hear this bell, then there's some food coming. So the dog salivates to prepare it for eating the food, right? So it's salivating so it can more easily digest and eat the food. So two different theories for the same system. Now, some of the major schools of thought that we're going to be covering in this class, two of the earliest ones, structuralism and functionalism. So structuralism studies the elements of consciousness. So how is it that we perceive color, right? What's the part of our consciousness that thinks about color? What's the part of our consciousness that thinks about sound? What's the part of our consciousness that thinks about up versus down? Functionalism looks less at what are the elements of consciousness and more about how does our conscious experience help us do things for the world around us. So not so much what the mind is, but what the mind does. Some other major schools of thought that we're going to be covering: cognitive psychology, so studying the conscious processes of the mind, and how does the mind take all the stuff that's going on in our world and convert it into thought and convert that into action. Compare that to behaviorism. Here, behaviorism doesn't worry about the mind at all. It's kind of the opposite of cognitive psychology. Behaviorism says we don't got to worry about what's going on in here. All we got to worry about is input and output, stimulus and response. Compare that to Gestalt psychology, which is looking at a combination of the mind and behavior. Gestalt kind of means a wholeness, or looking at the whole of something. So instead of just looking at the mind or just looking at behavior, trying to see how the two of those things influence each other and how we look at it as a whole. Psychoanalysis focuses on the unconscious mind, often in an attempt to solve some kind of psychological malady. So if you're looking at why somebody's feeling depressed or anxious or scared about something, psychoanalysis says, okay, well, what are the unconscious processes? What are the things going on below the surface of your mind that might be driving these maladies? So psychoanalysis is often about helping people with a mental illness get better. And then compare that with humanistic psychology. So humanistic psychology, instead of focusing on how to make sick people better, it's focusing on how do we achieve our full potential. So, you might not have a particular psychological disorder, but maybe you feel like you're not really living your best life, or you're maybe not kind of existing as your best self. Humanistic psychology would try to, figure out, okay, how do we self-actualize, right? How do we attain our full potential? So a word that's going to come up in this class a lot is something called a paradigm. Now, a paradigm just means a concept or an approach that almost everybody in a field can agree on. And if you think about, let's see this diagram on the right here. So the heliocentric model of the solar system, right? Almost, I can't think of a credible astronomer who would reject this model. You've got the sun at the center of the solar system, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and then the moon is a satellite of the Earth, Mars, etc., right? So the sun is in the center of our solar system. Now, there are often these paradigm shifts within science, where so much evidence gathers that's to the contrary of one paradigm that the whole model has to change in order for science to move forward. So what did we believe before the heliocentric model? Well, the geocentric model. So before people like Galileo and Copernicus, most astronomers believed that the Earth was in the middle of the solar system, right? And why not? Because we look and we observe, oh, well, it looks like the sun's moving around the Earth. It looks like the moon's moving around the Earth, just like all the other planets are. They seem to be moving relative to us. So we must be in the middle of it all. So that was the paradigm before Copernicus and Galileo, and this is the paradigm after Copernicus and Galileo, right? This is an example of a paradigm shift. Now, this concept of a paradigm was kind of popularized by a philosopher named Thomas Kuhn. You can read more about this in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, a very influential book on the philosophy of science. Now, Kuhn believed that social sciences like psychology couldn't have a paradigm. He believed that there's just too much disagreement, too many different perspectives, and there's not a whole lot that people in social sciences agree on when it comes to behavior, so there must not be a paradigm. Or at least we're pre-paradigmatic. Pre-paradigmatic? I don't know how to pronounce that. So I think that that's, maybe has some truth to it, but it doesn't mean that there aren't some things that most psychologists would agree on. Most, not all. One example of an emerging paradigm in psychology is something called the biopsychosocial model. So in this model, but human behavior can be explained as a combination of biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors. So biological things might be genetic predispositions, your physical health, your metabolism, your immune system. Psychological influences might be things like your memories, your perceptions, your accumulated experiences of the world. And the social factors are things like, well, what environment are you living in, right? Are you living in a place that's warm and accepting? Is it more cold and challenging? What's the major religion? What's the major political viewpoints, right? What are the cultural and societal expectations? And so what the biopsychosocial model says is that human behaviors are some combination of these three things. Now, compare that to earlier paradigms. When we look at Aristotle and Descartes and a lot of the pre-modern philosophers, they assume that at least some of human behavior is being driven by supernatural forces, right? Things like the soul or a spirit. And in the biopsychosocial model, it doesn't explicitly say there's no soul. It just doesn't really include it in its model. Right? So the biopsychosocial model is sort of agnostic when it comes to supernatural influences and focuses primarily on natural influences. Whereas what we'll see later on this week when we get into those pre-modern philosophers is they, had a pretty firm belief in some kind of force that we might these days call supernatural. Doesn't mean that it's wrong, right? I'm not saying that that's wrong. It just means that that's a different paradigm than the one we'll see most modern psychologists using. Again, most, but not all. Okay, so next time we are going to be focusing on the ways of knowing. So why is it that these ancient philosophers came to such different conclusions than modern day social scientists? We're going to be looking at, the ways that we come to believe that things are true and how we believe it's true and the methods that we use for that. And we'll also take a look at the persistent questions in psychology. So, there are certain fundamental questions about what humans are, what the nature of humanity is, that are ongoing, right? It's not likely that they're going to be solved anytime soon, but they sort of form the basis for a lot of research in philosophy and in psychology as well. Okay, so I'll leave off there and we'll start talking about the ways of knowing and persistent questions tomorrow. Have a good one.